Moldova. Welcome, Mihai. There are a lot of people here tonight who are the firsts in their field, and our next panelist is Dame Louise Richardson. She's the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Before that, she was an educator, 20 years at Harvard, and then was the first female head at Oxford. She's also the first female president of the Carnegie Corporation. Yves Leterme is the former Prime Minister of Belgium, and I'm told, or actually I read today, that he is a great and passionate fan, Yves, of goats. Is that correct? I read that in Wikipedia, so it must be true, right? Because everything in Wikipedia is true. Yves, former Prime Minister, thank you for being with us. Raj Kumar is the president and editor-in-chief at DevEx, a media platform for the global development community. Raj, welcome.
Good to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. And finally, the former president of Costa Rica, the Honorable Laura Chinchilla, the first and so far only female to lead that country. President Chinchilla, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Let me see if I can go through this. Thank you.
So I'm going to go a little bit off script because it's going to bother me if I stand here and I'm speaking to the backs of my panelists' heads. So I'm going to wander around the way Phil Donahue used to. Anybody remember Phil Donahue? Phil Donahue, Geraldo, they walked around the audience and they asked their questions from here. So with your indulgence, please pardon my back as I address the panelists. Minister Popshoy, let me start with you. I think many people in this room and around the world feel that authoritarianism, autocracy, is making some kind of comeback around the world. Do you see that? And how do you explain it, if so?
This is for me.
Not only do we see it, we have experience in Moldova, unfortunate experience with autocracy, because in 2019, when we came to power, Moldova was ruled by an oligarch that was strangling Moldova's democracy. And it was this young team that President Sandu put together that created this change. And Moldova was going through a slippery slope. And it was that autocrat, he didn't take us seriously. He was calling us backpackers because we would carry the laptops with us to work everywhere. And it was his undoing. Because had he taken us seriously, he would have probably put us in prison. He would have denied us access to elections. But we did participate in elections. The citizens of Moldova gave us a chance. And as they say, the rest is history. Now we have 63% of seats in parliament.
What is the appeal of an autocrat?
The appeal of an autocrat can be different. Some can try to outright bribe voters. Some can use can be demagogues. Some can use control over media to stifle opposition voices. Some can use coercion and fear and undermine and destroy opposition. So there are many recipes, if you will, to undermine democracy. But there is only one recipe to foster democracy, is to trust your people, is to engage with your people, and to be the champion of freedom. Because once people have tasted freedom, and in Moldova they have, once they have tasted free elections, no reasonable person wants to go back where his or her dignity is being denied by autocrats who believe that they know better. No autocrat can know better than his society.
Ms. Richardson, let me ask a related question to the one that the minister just answered, and that is, he explained it a little bit, but let me ask you how you would respond to the question, how do autocrats get the upper hand, particularly in states, for example, in Eastern Europe, that so recently and memorably embraced democracy? How do autocrats make a comeback?
Well, I think they make a comeback by appealing to populism, but the reason they become popular, I think we have to acknowledge the recent failings of democracy. We've presided over extraordinary growth and inequality. We've presided over a surge in immigration to Europe, to countries in Europe and this country, which has been deeply unpopular amongst the population, and they feel threatened by large numbers of people coming into the country. Populists have exploited this to play on people's fears. Populist message has been well received because people's standard of living is not rising in the way that they expected. And I would look here at the consequence of the 2008 financial crash, where so many people in the Western world suffered, when very few of and they see very few of those responsible having paid any price. So I think we have to acknowledge that democracies have not functioned as effectively and as responsibly to their populations, and I think we're suffering the consequences.
We
today.
touched on it a little bit in the first panel. We talked about the erosion of trust that accompanies, for example, great income inequality, or the failure, as you just pointed out, to hold individuals accountable for some of the pain that was felt around the world globally during the financial crisis. So it's an erosion of, partly we're responsible for our own demise to the extent that democracy is under assault in some countries.
No, I believe so, and as you mentioned, I'm an educator, and I believe our education is we haven't invested adequately in public education, and as a consequence in many democracies, and especially in this one, vast numbers of the population don't actually understand how our democracies work. Astonishing number couldn't describe in the most rudimentary form the nature of the democracy in which they live. So I think we have failed in our investment in public education to ensure that people appreciated the advantages of democracy, because unlike the people referred to earlier, they've no experience of anything else. So we've started to take democracy for granted, I think.
President Chinchilla, how do autocrats subvert democracy, specifically in Latin America, Central America, Latin America? How do they do it? Is the playbook different in Latin America than it is elsewhere around the world, or is it similar?
Yes. First, I will go back to some of the comments that have been made here, because I, for example, disagree, and I don't want to be very negative about, what is happening in other regions. But when you analyze what is happening now in Latin America experienced the most impressive democratic spring ever. I mean, there were more than 20 countries who, in a very short period of time, changed from the military rule to the democratic rule. That was 40 years ago. But however, now we are experiencing a regression. So it seems that, yes, freedom is an aspiration of most of the humanity. But once that the people feel fear or they are frustrated because governments do not deliver, they just want a change. It doesn't matter if that change means sacrificing their freedom and democracy. And so that is what is happening right now in Latin America.
And so if things aren't going well, the populace says, we want to change, and if someone comes forward with
yes, right.
and says, I've got the solution,
yes,
they may put that person in power, and yes, that person may hold power
right.
indefinitely.
The question is relatively easy to understand. Of course, it is a very complex process, but if you add dissatisfaction with governments, doesn't matter how democratic the government is, but dissatisfaction with the institution of governments because they are not delivering. If you add fear about the present, about the future, now, globally speaking, 6 out of 7 people in the world feel fear about the future. If you have those two factors together, the next factor, and that is confirmed by almost every poll in every region, if you have those two factors, the third one is I wouldn't mind to vote for an autocrat. I wouldn't mind to vote for a president if even he is going to govern without Congress. For example, that is a question that we made in Latin America. And so populism, basically, to finish my intervention and finally answer your question, is populists, of course, they know what is happening, but instead of trying to channelize in a positive and creative and proactive way those negative sentiments, they feed those negative sentiments, and so the situation goes even worse. So basically, that's.
Prime Minister Leterme, there are certainly ways that democracy has come under attack from within sometimes, but most pointedly and most tragically from without. In the case of Ukraine, there a democracy was literally attacked by a foreign nation, an invading nation. What's at stake in Ukraine, and what outcomes do you see as potentially possible?
Well, if you allow me, I would like to follow the example of Laura and elaborate a little bit on one aspect I think we should not underestimate. It is that representative democracy that is in crisis currently, backsliding lots of countries, is in fact an invention which was started to be implemented in the 19th century with the trias politica, with very complex interactions between the three main forces. Then we got the 20th century, the mass membership-driven big political parties based on mainstream ideologies. And my impression is that these institutional frameworks and the system of opinion making is in crisis, is not fit for purpose for the 21st century. And so we, in between, have a kind of speeding up of development of things. We have a Uberization of opinion making, which doesn't need to go through all these and trickle down through all these intermediate layers. And this is excellent breeding ground for populists. So I think there is also more than just the issue of under-delivery and over-promising, of simplism. There is also the fact, I think, that our institutions and the way we have filtered opinion and have organized debates based on this political party landscape, this is not fit for purpose anymore in the 21st century. Then coming to your question, in the remaining 10
I enjoyed
seconds.
the first part.
Yeah. Well, I can elaborate if you want, but I'm not a specialist of Ukraine, far from. But of course, when you're under attack from a foreign nation and you undergo aggression, I think it is about then the essence of what a institutional setup, what a government, what political institutions should do, and it's to protect people. And so, if you ask me the outcome of what's happening, I would concentrate on the issue about democracy, and I think what is at stake is whether we support the capacity of the leadership in Ukraine to prevail, to restore the norm, the sovereignty of the country. If we manage to do that, I think there's potentially a very strong, willingness of the people to stick to to support their institutions. If, at the contrary, the democracies and Western societies and the allies, normally the allies of Ukraine, don't support the Ukrainian leadership, I think there we are at brink of let's say, a collapse of the democratic institutions, and this could be a kind of tumbling stone that for the surrounding nations could be very dangerous. So there's more at stake than just, I would say, a very regional local conflict. It's about an autocracy attacking a democracy.
There was, Minister Popshoy, I guess I'm going to ask you basically the same question. What is at stake? You live in that part of the world. What's at stake in Ukraine, and what do you see as the possible end game or outcome?
Well, it is apparent that at stake is the survival of Ukraine as a nation, the Republic of Moldova as well. But the war is not about territory. For Putin, God knows he has enough. The war is about the new imperial ambition of the Kremlin, but also about undermining the consolidation of democracy in Ukraine. Because if citizens of Ukraine have a consolidated democracy, then the citizens of Russia will start asking questions. How come Ukraine has independent media and we don't? How come Ukrainian society, civil society, can question the actions of the government and how the resources are being spent and why there is so much corruption and we in Russia cannot? How come Ukraine has presidents that change and we do not? And all these questions are an existential threat to the regime in Moscow. So the war is as much about territory and neo-imperial ambitions as it is about the continuation of the regime, the survival of the regime, and the biggest threat to the survival of the regime in Russia is a successful, democratic, and prosperous Ukraine, and Republic of Moldova, and other countries in the region. So we see it loud and clear, and that is why it is so important that we in the Republic of Moldova try to maintain and do our utmost to walk this difficult path of consolidating our democratic institutions, of ensuring rule of law, going through this very tedious but important vetting system of rooting and throwing out of the system corrupt judges and prosecutors. Because when you do that, and when you continue to provide and have access to independent media, have a competitive electoral political system, that is the way that you ensure that a country can live up to its potential, and that is what Ukraine tried to do, and that's what Ukraine is fighting every single day, defending their future, their democracy, defending Moldova quite literally, and defending the values that we all share.
And so the attack was on an idea as much as it was on a country, the idea of freedom, which Mr. Putin clearly fears.
Very much so. I mean, the idea of freedom to a former KGB agent is an antithesis of the worldview that he has. And it is sad that it's painful to watch not just Ukraine, Moldova, but also Russia. Because the citizens of Russia are as much hostages of these troubles as is the entire region. So we hope that the international community will remain steadfast in helping Ukraine defend its territory, its sovereignty, and its democratic future, and by extension provide a hope to the many Russians that also want a democratic future for themselves, and of course a future for all of us in the region.
Raj, I saw you nodding there, so I'll get you to react to what the minister just said, but also jump in with some thoughts about how media platforms like yours can bolster, fortify democracy, and maybe make the work of autocrats harder.
I'm happy to do that, Tyler. And some of our international guests may not be familiar with your daily show, Power Lunch, which I'm a big fan. So it's great to be part of the Power Dinner.
Thank you.
That you're hosting here,
We
Tyler.
count our viewers by the tens, by the way, so that's great. Thank you.
It is a good example, though, of what I want to talk about, and to get to your question, which is I don't think it's incidental that fact-based independent media has been under extreme challenge for the last couple of decades, at the same time as we've seen a rise in authoritarianism. The internet undermined a lot of the business models of media. Social media, as we heard, has allowed direct connections between all kinds of opinion makers and the public. And there's a real information war underway. I mean, let's not forget, we're talking about the situation in Ukraine. Of course, Russia used traditional military resources to attack, but every day it spends, or every year, hundreds of millions of dollars on RT, its network of Russian television, on Sputnik, its radio networks. I remember shortly after the invasion, I was in my home city of Washington, D.C. driving and flipping through the radio channels, and I heard someone in a very traditional American voice, sounded like my next door neighbor, telling me that Ukraine is filled with Nazis. And it took a second to realize, oh, I flipped to the Sputnik radio station. There's an information war underway. We just had the case, a couple of weeks ago here in the United States where the FBI found that RT had invested $10 million in a conservative podcast network to try to undermine confidence in the US election. So I think the point is, when you think about why are authoritarians on the upswing, what is driving this. There's a concerted effort to utilize the weakness in the news media today, to use the challenges that this business finds itself in against itself and in the favor of those who would wish to undermine democracy.
Ms. Richardson, President Richardson, I should say, are you optimistic? You pointed out some of the flaws of democracy a few moments ago, or some of the things that democracy has not succeeded at, I guess is maybe a better way to put it. Are you optimistic about democracy?
I think of what Gramsci said when he was asked that question. He said, optimism of the heart and pessimism of the mind. Or Desmond Tutu, when he was asked that question, said he found himself a prisoner of hope. For myself, I've always thought of, notwithstanding the difficulties universities have had in the past year, that universities were the last bastion of the optimist. If you're teaching smart, idealist young people every day, you've got to believe that they will make the world a better place than we've given them. So yes, at an emotional level, I feel optimistic. At a rational level, like Gramsci.
And at that rational level, what I sense an unease.
Well, of course, an unease, because as I say, I'm not sure whether my optimism is. I know it's probably more aspirational than analytical, which was what Gramsci was getting at. Because if one looks at the state of democracy in this country, it doesn't inspire optimism, does it?
Well, that was a question I was going to ask you this, Raj, and I'll come back to you and maybe get your response to it, because the next question is, how healthy do you think democracy is in the United States? There's a tremendous amount of distrust of institutions in this country. So many people, including a lot of young people, distrust institutions, whatever they are, whether it's academic institutions, the press, the government. How do you assess that?
You know, I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and they do an annual study to look at national security risks in the United States. And this year, for the first time ever, one of the items on the list was U.S. domestic civil strife. And it showed up as number 1 on the list. People are very concerned, and I think rightly concerned. You ask a good question, Tyler. It's hard to answer, but I think we're going to know the answer in a few weeks. We're going to see, not just on Election Day, but in the weeks after that, how this country responds, perhaps to a contested election. We've had this in the past. We saw this in 2000 in Florida when you saw people raiding some of the offices where they're counting votes. We saw this obviously through mostly the legal system the last time until January 6th when you saw people raiding the Capitol. So we're going to find out, I think, what this democracy is made of. And like many of the countries that are represented on the stage and in this room, who have had to actually fight and sacrifice for their democracy, Americans might find themselves in a situation where they have to protest in a way that they haven't traditionally had to ensure there's a free election.
President Chinchilla, can democracy flourish around the world, and most especially in your region, if it is not modeled well in the United States? In other words, how important is the United States and its global image as the bastion of democracy to the flourishing of democracy in other countries?
Oh, it's very important. It's very critical for the rest of the hemisphere, I will say. In fact, after the 2016 election here in the United States, and I remember that was the first time that the United States invited a foreign electoral observation mission, and I was the head of that mission. And 2 years later, I also was the head of the electoral observation mission in Brazil when Bolsonaro won the election. And it was exactly the same kind of script that Bolsonaro followed in Brazil and the one that Trump had used here in the United States. And then after Bolsonaro, there were many other small countries who also experienced the same kind of political campaigns, basically polarizing, basically using social media for disinformation. Everything was very clear. I mean, it was like clear cut, the kind of actions that they follow in many countries. And now, even my country one of the most stable democracies in Latin America. They are Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile. And my country, Costa Rica, has already experienced this kind of political campaigns and this kind of leadership, because let's remember, the industry, the electoral industry, they are just interested in making money and winning campaigns. So if here something works, that means that they can export the same model to the rest of the region.
Minister Popshoy, are you optimistic about democracy?
Sorry?
Yes.
I am.
Mr.
I am optimistic about democracy, and it's not just because we have elections on October 20th. and you cannot win elections on pessimism. But I'm optimistic because of what I see on the ground in Moldova. Moldova is one of the few countries, unfortunately, that democracy is thriving as opposed to backsliding. And the way we do that is that we empower all of our citizens. We doubled the number of women in parliament, because when you have more Gregs and Mikes than women in parliament, you have a problem. And when you have parliament that is not representative of the society, you have a problem. So we implemented legislation that had a double quota and at least 4 men or women in every 10 seats on the ticket in parliament. And we also did it at the local level, in regional local councils. And it's not just because we had a woman president, but because we believe that that is right. And we have in parliament also many young people in our faction, because we try to have a truly representative parliament. And the society resonates with these messages. And not only that, but we also try to also have a more fairer distribution of the resources, even though we are a center-right political party, and our electorate was not exactly rural senior citizens, but we knew it was the right thing to increase the minimum pension, because senior citizens could not live under the subsistence level. We did that. Of course, now we have a lot more support in rural senior citizens. But we also have support among the youth, among the urban voters, among the higher educated voters. And you need to try to have elected officials to truly represent the society. And in many countries, going back to the disillusionment in democracy, many parliaments are not representative.
Prime Minister Leterme, let's come back to a question that sort of been lingering in the air, and that is, how important is the health of democracy in the United States and the health of the rule of law in the United States to democracies around the globe? Can democracy flourish around the globe if the U.S. isn't modeling it well?
Well, to be fair and provocative, I'm not sure that democracy is flourishing at this time in the US. I mean, if you watch TV debates like the one almost 2 or 3 weeks ago, what one of the 2 candidates was putting forward as his view on reality and the kind of arguments that were made, I think that both the people that live in democracies, representative democracies, parliamentary democracies, but certainly also the people outside, I mean, this gives a very bad impression. And so to answer your question, it is of crucial importance that you in the US fix some issues you have. It is how politicians are allowed or not allowed to manipulate reality. I've been a big consumer of electoral processes because I stood for a lot of elections. In Belgium, you always stand for elections at all levels. I would never have survived or be elected if I would use the kind of arguments or if I would misrepresent a reality, like apparently it is still allowed here in the US. Number 2, democracy in a very summarized way is the exercise of public authority under the control of the people and the equality of the people in the exercise of the control. The way they control public authority. Well, the role money plays in your electoral processes is biasing the essence of democracy. And these
The
are
role
all-
of money.
the role of money.
Mm-hmm.
The role of money, yeah. Your donations and the way political candidates here have to beg for financial support, and where the role money plays in electoral competition. And so for us as supporters of democracy, as people living in representative democracies, but also people that watch what's happening here from the outside. I spent twice 3 weeks of my summer in China. And we talk about China as a monolithic fact, but there are 1.4 billion people living there, including young people that aspire for progress, that aspire also for maybe other political systems. Well, the bad impression the US is currently projecting the way you practice democracy in, for instance, the presidential elections, is giving a very bad taste, a very bad impression to people that would think that democracy in the long term would also be the best way to organize their own country.
Prime Minister, you've given us much to think about. A lot of weighty thoughts there. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate the work of the panel tonight. Thank you so much. I neglected to mention one first, and Ms. Richardson, is that you were the first person in your family to go to college. Is that right?
Yes.
You were born in Ireland? Way to go. Love that. My father's family's from Norway. My grandmother was from Ireland, and I just got my Irish passport. Very proud to say. I'm an Irishman. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for your attention tonight. I believe at this point, you all can return to your chairs. A round of applause for the panel once again. And I believe I'm supposed to turn it back to Jay for just some final remarks and dessert.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, I want to share a photo. Are you living in Costa Rica? Are you living in Costa Rica? We cover global development, so we cover the UN, the World Bank,